The noise Corporal Yeva Brandt made when they dragged her out was not a scream. It was a laugh. She heard it come out of her own mouth and couldn't stop it. This terrible, high, broken sound, half law and half sub, as her boots scraped furrows in the gray soil of the processing yard, and the Keth guards shoved her onto her knees beside what was left of Sergeant Okafor. She knew it wasn't the right thing to do. She knew it made her look like she'd cracked, like the fear had finally eaten through the wiring and left something feral and twitching underneath. But she couldn't stop. She looked at what they'd done to Okafor over the last 6 hours. And she laughed until her ribs hurt, until the guards tipped their long flat heads at each other, in that way they had. That slow lateral tilt that meant something between confusion and contempt, and she thought, good, let them think I'm broken. It costs nothing to let them think that. Okafor was still alive. She could see his chest moving, shallow and fast. Under the blue-gray membrane, they'd wrapped around his upper torso to hold him together. The Keth had a word for what they'd done to him. She'd heard it once through a translator's earpiece, back when humanity still had translators and earpieces, and anything that could be called a chain of command. The word translated, approximately, as a reading. As in, we read the body. We open it like a text and find out what's written inside. They'd been reading Okafor for 6 hours, and whatever they'd found hadn't satisfied them. Brandt controlled herself. The spasms stopped. She got her breathing down to something functional, and looked around the yard with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who is cataloging, not panicking. This was a skill she'd developed over 17 months of surviving things that should have killed her, starting with the first orbital strikes on Meridian Station and ending, she supposed, here, in this gray-walled processing compound on the Keth Command Moon, hands bound behind her, with a filament. So thin it felt like nothing, and so strong, it had cut through 3 millimeters of skin just from the tension of her pulling against it. Once, she'd stopped pulling. The compound was roughly oval, 40 meters at its widest, maybe 30 at the narrow end where the gate was. The walls were 3 meters of that dense gray-black material the Keth used for everything. Harvested, she'd been told, from the bones of their world ships, ground to powder, and resintered with some biological compound she'd never had access to the analysis of. Whatever it was, it didn't conduct heat, and it didn't reflect light, and it swallowed sound like a held breath. There were 9 guards. She counted them twice. 9, in 3 rotating clusters of 3, with a gap pattern that repeated on a cycle of roughly 4 minutes. The gap was a habit. She'd noticed it before, in the camps on Meridian. The Keth were extraordinarily disciplined in everything except repetition. They fell into patterns the way water fell downhill, without noticing, without meaning to, because the pattern was efficient. And efficiency was the entire architecture of their civilization. What they'd never understood about humans, what they still didn't understand, she suspected, was that humans noticed patterns the way other things noticed gravity, automatically, constitutively. The noticing wasn't a skill you learned. It was the baseline. 9 guards, a gap every 4 minutes, a single gate at the narrow end, operated by a palm lock keyed to Keth biology, walls too smooth to climb, ground too hard to dig. She filed this away and looked at Okafor again. His eyes were open. That was something. His eyes tracked to her face and stayed there, and she saw in them the things she'd been afraid she wouldn't see. Not defeat, not absence. Just pain, and underneath the pain, the same attention she was directing at the yard. He was still in there. He was still counting. Good, she thought. Stay with me, Jonas. She didn't say it out loud. She smiled at him instead. A small smile, tight and private, the kind you give someone across a crowded room when you need them to know you're still playing the game. He blinked once, slowly. That was enough. The guards hadn't spoken to her yet. They were waiting. She'd seen this behavior before, too. The Keth had a system of silences, a whole grammar of withheld speech, and right now the silence meant, we are letting you imagine what comes next. We are letting the imagination do the work. It was, she supposed, a form of efficiency. Why spend resources breaking a body when the body would break itself on the machinery of its own fear. She had been afraid. She wanted to be honest about that, at least with herself. For the first 20 minutes after capture, she had been comprehensively, architecturally afraid. The kind of fear that doesn't feel like emotion but like physics. Like the planet is tilted wrong. Like every equation you've ever trusted has changed its values overnight. She'd been afraid on the transport. She'd been afraid when they processed her and took her equipment and filed her biosignature and spoke about her in their language in front of her, as if she were a specimen in a tray. She'd been afraid when they brought her to the yard, and she saw Okafor already there, already wrapped in blue-gray membrane, already reading, but that was 20 minutes ago. Fear had a shape, and she'd learned to lean into the shape of it until it changed. The fear in the first 20 minutes after capture had a specific texture she could have described clinically if someone had asked her. Nobody ever asked. People who'd been in the camps understood it, without description, and people who hadn't been in the camps didn't need to understand it. But she turned it over sometimes, in quiet moments, the way you turn over something painful because it is yours. The first tier was physical. The body's standard alarm response, adrenal, simple, older than language. The second tier was the recognition of context, which was worse. Not just danger, but this danger. The specific danger she'd been working for 17 months to avoid arriving at. The third tier was the worst and the most interesting, the recalculation. The moment when the body's alarm subsided enough for the analytical mind to kick back in and begin the immediate, automatic, constitutive work of, what are the options here? The third tier had saved her life at least 4 times, possibly more. She'd lost count of the close things, the moments where the difference between the outcome she'd had and the outcome she hadn't had was a calculation made in the window between fear and acceptance. The third tier didn't feel like courage. It felt like her brain refusing to file the situation under closed. She'd filed it under open problem, working. That was 20 minutes ago. Fear had a shape, and she'd learned to lean into the shape of it until it changed. What it changed into was never calm. Not exactly. Calm was a thing for people in rooms with roofs and locks, and the administrative certainty that nothing was going to arrive and change the terms without warning. What it changed into was something narrower and more functional, the specific state of attention that she'd come to think of as her operational mode, the setting her mind defaulted to when it had nothing left to do except what needed doing. She thought about the pod. She didn't think about it often. The pod was the kind of experience that, if you let yourself process it in real time, had the potential to take up space you needed for other things. 17 days. The emergency rations had run out on day 9. She'd filtered her own water from the condensation on the hull interior. She'd slept in 4-hour cycles and spent the rest of the time reading the Halloway files she'd committed to memory and thinking about what use they could be made to serve. Thinking about Okafor too, who she hadn't known was still alive, who she'd assumed was dead because his last communication to her had been 3 seconds of audio through a cracking internal channel. I'm hit. Keep going. Don't come back. And the context of the transport being boarded by a Keth patrol. 3 seconds of audio and an instruction not to return was the kind of information that translated, practically, file, under confirmed loss, recalculate without. She'd recalculated without him for 17 days. She'd built the plan without him, designed every component for a single operator, accounted for every contingency she could think of with the assumption that she was alone. Then she'd arrived at the compound and seen him there, and something in her internal architecture had done a very quiet recalibration that she hadn't acknowledged to herself because acknowledging things could wait until there was time. There was time now. She was sitting in the cold, with her hands bound behind her and a plan she was building from the inside out. And she could afford, for maybe 45 seconds, to acknowledge that when she'd seen Okafor across the compound yard, alive, damaged, bound, still paying attention, something had changed in the structure of what she was willing to do. not in the plan. The plan was the plan, in the parameters she was willing to operate under, in what she was willing to accept if the plan didn't work cleanly, in what she was willing to spend. She'd been spending herself for 17 months. That was not a complaint. There was nobody to complain to, and she had chosen this, had taken every step on this trail with full knowledge that the trail cost what it cost. She'd lost things. She'd left Okafor behind on the transport, following his instruction, and she'd filed him and kept going, and she'd been in the pod for 17 days, and she'd been functional and operational, and she'd built the plan, and the plan was good. But something about seeing him here, seeing him in the compound where she was also going to have to be, seeing the specific possibility that the plan she'd designed for one operator might also, somehow, account for two, had loosened something she hadn't known was clenched. She'd been on her own for a long time. That was a statement of practical reality, not an emotional complaint. Operationally, being alone was sometimes better. Fewer variables, simpler decision trees, no requirement to account for another person's unpredictable choices. But it was also, in ways she'd cataloged and filed, without particularly examining, narrowing. When you were the only person in the room was the size of your own thinking. There was nobody to disagree with your assumptions, nobody to see the thing you'd stopped being able to see because you'd been looking at it too long. She thought about the guard rotation she'd read. She thought about whether there was a gap in the reading she'd missed because she'd been looking for what she expected to find, rather than what was. There, she ran the rotation again in her head. Cluster 1, Cluster 2, Cluster 3, 4-minute cycle, 11-second gap, and she checked it the way you check a calculation that might have an error in it. Not to confirm, but to find the error if it existed. The gap was real. She hadn't missed anything, but she'd been looking for exits. She'd been looking for an 11-second window to the north wall and the maintenance port. She hadn't been looking for what Okafor had subsequently found when he threw the canister at the gate control. She hadn't been looking for the gate at all because the gate was biometric, and she'd filed it as unavailable. Okafor had not filed it as unavailable. Okafor had looked at the gate and seen a different kind of problem than she'd seen. He'd found what she hadn't been looking for, because he'd been looking from a different direction. She filed this. She filed it next to everything else she'd learned about the systematic limits of single operator analysis, and she held it there for a moment before the plan reasserted itself, and she moved on. 2 people in a room could see more of the room. That was all. That was the whole of it. She heard Okafor's breathing across the yard, slow, careful, the rhythm of someone managing pain with the discipline of long practice. She heard the guard's rotation, the particular ground contact sound of their movement. She heard the distant percussion beyond the walls, the thing that might be a bombardment, or a world ship's atmospheric engines, the background noise of a war that was happening at a scale she could barely perceive from inside this compound. She thought the scale of the war did not matter to the person in the compound. The person in the compound had 9 guards, and a 4-minute cycle, and a plan that was either going to work or wasn't. The scale of the war was for later, for whoever came after, for the people on the asteroid, who would take the chip and the synthesis pathway, and do something with it that she might or might not live to see. She was in charge of the compound. That was enough. That was exactly enough. Now she was mostly thinking about the guards, and about the fact that the Keth commander of this installation had not come out yet. She knew he would come. She'd been studying Keth command structure for 14 months, from the wreckage of Meridian Station to the transit camps of the Outer Belt to a 3-week period she didn't like to think about in detail aboard, a prisoner transport that had been, technically, taking her somewhere worse than here. She'd escaped from the transport. She'd ended up here instead, through a chain of events that included 17 days in an emergency life pod, a chance intercept by a Keth patrol, and a bad decision she'd made at the last possible moment that she was still not entirely sure had been a bad decision. The commander would come, because this was what Keth commanders did. They monitored the processing of high-value captures in person, and Brant was, by any measure, a high-value capture. Not because of her rank. Corporal was nothing. She'd been a corporal for 11 months because the people who'd have promoted her kept dying. And there was a practical limit to the administrative reach of humanity's remaining military infrastructure, which at last count had been reduced to 4 functioning ships and a command post on an asteroid that appeared on no Keth chart, not because of her survival record, impressive as it was, by the statistical standards of anyone who'd been inside the perimeter since Meridian, because of what she knew. Specifically, because of what she'd taken from the transit transport before she escaped from it, because of what she'd been carrying inside her own head for the last 17 days in the pod, encoded in the particular firing patterns of her memory in a way that no Keth scanner had yet been able to read, the technical specifications for Project Halloway. She turned this over in her mind, the way you turn a smooth stone in your pocket, feeling its weight and edges. Project Halloway was 73 years of accumulated human understanding about Keth biology, compressed into a single weapons design. It was the work of 32 scientists across 9 research installations. It was the reason 4 of those 9 installations no longer existed. The Keth had found out about it, or guessed, or inferred, and had done what the Keth did. It was the reason the transit transport had been going somewhere worse than here. It was also, she had decided sometime on day 11 in the pod, her ticket out of everything. The gate opened. She had time, in the fraction of a second, before she focused on the figure, walking through it, to notice that the 3 guard clusters had subtly changed their orientation. A shift of maybe 15 degrees each, unconscious, automatic, the way iron filings shift when you bring a magnet near. This was how she knew it was someone important before she saw the face. The Keth commander was tall, even by Keth standards. They ran to height. Something to do with the lower gravity of their homeworld. She'd read in a Zenobia report she'd found on the transport. Though she wasn't sure the report had been accurate, this one was nearly 2.5 meters, which put its head at a level that made her neck ache to look at directly. Its coloring was deep gray violet, the pigmentation that indicated elder caste. Not old exactly, not the way humans meant old, but experienced, established, carrying a rank that had been earned rather than assigned. Its face was what the Keth called a primary surface, the expressive zone, the part that moved. Humans, she'd noticed, fixated on the Keth face and found it unreadable because they were looking in the wrong direction. The Keth emoted primarily through the fine musculature of the neck and the lateral ridge of the skull, not through the flattened features that occupied the space a human would have called a face. If you knew what you were looking at, the commander's expression was extraordinarily legible right now. Satisfaction, curiosity, the precise emotional flavor that translated somewhere between interest and appetite. It stood and looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. "You are the one," it said, through a translation device clipped to its collar. The device was good, better than anything she'd encountered in the camps. The voice that came out of it was low, neutral, neither male nor female in the way it occupied the register. It spoke with the flat precision of something that had been calibrated to imply nothing. The one from the transport. The one who took something. "I don't know what you mean," Brant said. The commander made a small lateral movement with its head. Not the contempt tilt of the guards. Something more considered. "You know exactly what we mean. You were cataloged on the transport. We know what passed through your processing station before you escaped. We know what the transport was carrying. Then you already have what you need. We do not have it. The files you accessed were corrupted in the escape. We have records of access, not content." Another small head movement. "You have the content." Brant looked at Okafor. He was watching her. She could see him working at the filament binding his wrists, the movement so small it was invisible unless you knew where to look. A shift of 3 millimeters. No more repeated on a cycle. He'd been doing it for hours. She could see where the skin had broken and rebroken. She couldn't tell if he was making progress. She hoped he was making progress. "What do you want to offer?" she said. The commander went very still. This was something she'd learned to read too. Keth, stillness wasn't the absence of expression. It was the full deployment of it. Every muscle locked meant, "This is important enough to wait. This matters enough to hold." "We want you to tell us what you know," it said. "And in return, you will not be processed." She let the silence sit for a moment. Okafor's eye contact was steady. She saw him blink twice. A signal they'd developed over 9 months of working together, starting in the transit camps on Meridian. 2 slow blinks meant, "I'm with you. Whatever you're doing, I'm with you," she said. "You're going to process me anyway, after I tell you." The commander did something with the ridge of its skull. A rapid, fine vibration she'd never been able to catalog accurately, but which she'd come to read as a particular kind of amusement, not cruelty. Something more impersonal than cruelty. "You are correct, that we have no reason to deviate from procedure after information is obtained, but the speed and quality of the procedure can vary significantly." "I want your word," Brant said. "Not mine, a Keth guarantee." The lateral head tilt again. This time the guards echoed it, just slightly, like a chord played in a lower register. "On what terms?" "I'll tell you what I know. In exchange, you give Okafor a transport out, back toward human space. Any transit point, I don't care which. And you give me a clean death. Fast, on my terms." The compound was very quiet. Even Okafor had stopped working at the filament. She could feel his attention on her like a physical weight. The commander regarded her for a long moment. Behind it, she heard something she hadn't registered yet. A small sound at the edge of perception, repeated and rhythmic, like something being sharpened. She didn't look. She kept her eyes on the commander's face. "These are unusual terms," it said. "I'm an unusual prisoner. You expect us to trust the value of what you carry." "No," Brant said. "I expect you to verify it. That's the easy part." She paused. "The part I want you to think about is this. I'm the only one who can tell you. The files were corrupted. The other researchers are dead. Your people killed them, systematically, over the last 14 months. The scientists who built Holloway, the analysts who interpreted it, the command staff who knew about it. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time on that transport, and now I am literally the last human being alive who knows what it contains. If you process me the way you processed Okafor, you'll get nothing useful. Pain is not a reliable information retrieval system. You know that. I know you know that." She watched the ridge vibration. She watched the lateral movement. She watched the subtle shift in the commander's neck musculature that she'd learned to read as calculating. "We are listening," it said. Behind her, beyond the compound walls, she could hear the faint, distant percussion of something. A bombardment, maybe, or the atmospheric engines of a Keth world ship entering orbit. She didn't know which. It didn't matter yet. What mattered now was the lie she was about to tell. She'd been building it for 11 days in the pod, between bouts of calculated sleep and the careful, deliberate work of organizing everything she actually knew about Keth biology, and everything she actually knew about Project Holloway, and everything she'd been able to deduce about the gap between the two. Because there was a gap, a significant one, and what lived in that gap was the only weapon she had left. Project Holloway, in the classified files she'd pulled from the transport, described a biological vulnerability unique to the elder caste Keth. Not a weapon, exactly, nothing so crude as that. A specific compound, delivered at the correct concentration to the correct dermal region, would pass through the Keth's secondary membrane. The outer skin layer that functions something like armor, something like a sensory organ, and interrupt the neural cascade that coordinated their involuntary threat response system. It wouldn't kill them. It wouldn't even incapacitate them. What it would do, for approximately 4 to 6 minutes, was render the elder caste individual incapable of initiating or transmitting the kill command. The kill command was the Keth's most efficient tool of command. It wasn't metaphorical. It was a specific neurological signal, transmitted through the ridge musculature, that could order the bodies of subordinate Keth to cease certain functions. Functions including the ones that kept them operational. It was how the Elder caste maintained control. It was why you never won a fight against a Keth commander by going for the guards first. The moment you posed a credible threat to the commander would drop the guards before you could use them. But for 4 to 6 minutes, Holloway's compound would stop that. For 4 to 6 minutes, a properly dosed commander would be unable to kill its own guards, unable to transmit the kill command to any subordinate within range. For 4 to 6 minutes, the guards would be autonomous, acting on their last standing orders, yes, but unable to receive new commands, unable to respond to the commander's threat assessment in real time. 4 to 6 minutes was enough. It was enough if you had a plan, and she had a plan, and the plan required her to tell the Eth commander the exact truth about one thing, and a precisely constructed lie about everything else. She had spent 11 days calibrating the lie. She had gone over every component of it, the way you go over a piece of equipment, before you trust your life to it, looking for the stress fractures, the load-bearing assumptions, the points where a question she hadn't anticipated could collapse the entire structure. She'd found 3 weak points and shored them up. She was reasonably confident that what she was about to say would hold. The truth, Project Holloway existed, was real, and contained a compound that could affect Keth Elder caste biology in the way she described. The lie, the compound required application to a specific dorsal region of the upper neck, a site that had no particular physiological significance, and that she'd chosen because it was observable, specific enough to sound technical, and located in exactly the right position for what she needed to happen. The secondary lie, she would offer to demonstrate the compound's efficacy on herself first, because she'd had herself inoculated with the counteragent before the transport, and the inoculation would hold for approximately 20 minutes. There was no counteragent. There was no inoculation. There was a small canister of a biochemical compound she'd taken from the transport's medical bay, legitimate, inert, something used for dermal sealing on Keth surgical wounds, that looked convincingly technical and would do absolutely nothing to a human body except moisturize it. The compound was clipped to the inside of her boot. They hadn't found it. They'd been thorough in their search, but the canister was sewn into the lining with filament thread, and the filament thread read as structural material on their scanners. She'd sewn it there herself. In the 40 seconds she'd had between the transport systems failing and the Keth patrol reaching her, she'd been thinking about this for longer than 40 seconds. She'd been thinking about this since day 1 in the pod, maybe longer. Since the moment on the transport when she'd seen what the files contained and understood, with the particular clarity that comes from having survived 17 months of things that should have killed you. Exactly how it might be used. She took a breath. She looked the commander in what she'd decided to call its face, for the sake of her own morale. "Here's what I want to offer," she said. She told it about Holloway, the real parts, the true parts, the verified science that would hold up against any analysis the Keth could run. She watched the commander's ridge carefully as she spoke, calibrating the lie against its reactions, adjusting the pitch and detail of each false element against what she could read. She was a fair hand at reading Keth expression by now. Fair wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing, and it was better than anything any other human she'd met could manage. The commander listened without moving. When she finished, it was still for a long time. "You are saying," it said finally, "that you can demonstrate this compound's effect." "On myself, yes. I've had the inoculation. I can apply it to the same region you'd apply it to a Keth elder. Show you that it passes through dermal tissue without cellular damage. Show you the absorption signature your scanners will detect. That gives you the methodology. The actual compound at Keth effective concentration, I'll describe to you. The full synthesis pathway, once Okafor is on a transport out." The sharpening sound behind the walls had stopped. The bombardment, if that's what it had been, had moved off. The compound was very quiet. "You understand," the commander said, "that we will verify everything you tell us." "I'm counting on it." Another long pause. The ridge vibration, the neck muscle shift. She watched all of it and said nothing, and held herself exactly as still as she needed to be. The commander made a decision. She could see it happen, not in its face, in the complex musculature of the neck and ridge, a settling, a consolidation, like a current finding its channel. It turned to the nearest guard and spoke briefly in Keth. A run of phony. She'd learned to parse imperfectly, but well enough. "Prepare the transport assessment. Open the sampling bay." Then it turned back to her. "If the demonstration is as you describe," it said. "We will consider the terms," she breathed. "One more thing," she said. The commander regarded her. "The demonstration. I do it standing, unbound, my hands free." She nodded toward the compound wall behind her. "Where the light hits some north section of the yard, there. In about an hour. The compound requires ambient warmth to activate properly on human tissue. The scanning signature I want you to see won't manifest clearly in the cold." She paused. "You can have every guard in this compound standing 3 meters away. I'm not asking you to give up security. I'm asking you to give me space to demonstrate something that requires me to have my hands free for about 4 minutes." She watched the commander calculate. The request was reasonable. The request was the kind of thing a prisoner legitimately running a demonstration would reasonably ask for. The request gave her hands free and her body mobile in the one part of the compound where the guard rotation pattern, which she had clocked, which cycled every 4 minutes, which created a window of approximately 11 seconds, when 2 of the 3 guard clusters were simultaneously at the far end of their rotation, created a gap she could use. She did not think the commander would see all of that. She thought it would see a reasonable request from a prisoner who had no obvious means of escape from a compound with 9 guards, smooth walls, and a biometric gate. The ridge vibration went through 3 distinct phases: rapid, slow, rapid, that she'd never been able to fully categorize, but which she associated with high-level assessment. Its neck muscles went through a subtle shift she'd come to read as something like reluctant concession. "We agree to these terms of demonstration," it said. "The decision on the transport, and on your terms of death, will follow the assessment." She nodded. She looked at Okafor. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Pain layered over attention. Layered over something that might have been, she thought, a quiet and private hope. She gave him the tight, small smile again. He blinked twice. "I'm with you," he said, "across the distance of 3 meters, and a compound full of Keth guards. Whatever you're doing." She remembered the day she'd first heard the name Halloway. It had been on Meridian Station, 6 weeks before the orbital strikes. At a briefing so classified she'd only been included because she was the only analyst still operational in Section 7, and Section 7 was the only section with the specific clearance the briefing required. And the clearance was required because someone had decided, correctly, that the information was the kind that changed the shape of everything downstream of it. Lieutenant Commander Perez had run the briefing. She'd liked Perez, compact, dry, with the specific economy of motion that came from 30 years of institutional warfare and the cultivated patience to wait for the enemy to show you what it was. She'd stood at the front of a room with 4 other people and a display panel and said, in the same tone she used for logistics, "We believe we have found something significant." The display had shown 73 years of observation data. The Keth had been in contact with humanity. Not announced contact, not exchange, but the distant monitoring and cataloging kind of contact that both species apparently conducted as a matter of course, for much longer than anyone had known. 73 years of that contact had produced, through the patient work of people, most of whom were now dead, a picture of something in Keth elder caste biology that nobody had expected to find. A weakness, not in their ships, not in their weapons, in them, in the specific architecture of the neural cascade system that gave the elder caste the kill command. The centralized control mechanism that made them so difficult to fight, that had cost humanity so much, that had turned every tactical advantage they'd ever found into a footnote, because the kill command could cancel tactical advantage the way you cancel a program instantly and completely from a distance. The kill command had a flaw, not a big flaw, not something you could exploit at scale, not something that would win a war by itself. A small flaw, the size of a precisely targeted compound, delivered at a specific concentration. But small flaws, Perez had said, with her logistics voice, her waiting voice, are how you make big flaws. Brandt had sat in that room and felt something shift in her internal architecture. Not hope. She was too experienced by then for the easy version of hope. Something more structural than hope. Something like the recognition that the math had changed. 2 weeks after that briefing, the orbital strikes began. 4 of the 9 research installations were gone within 72 hours. The Keth hadn't known about Holloway specifically. She'd later concluded that they'd had intelligence, indicating a vulnerability project existed, without knowing what it contained, and had responded with the overwhelming efficiency that characterized their approach to anything they perceived as an existential threat. By killing the scientists and destroying the installations, they'd believed they were closing the file. They hadn't known about the transport. They hadn't known that Perez, in the 4 days between the first strike and her own death, had done the most important thing she'd ever done. Compressed the tatty entire 73-year research program into a set of encoded files and put those files on a transport to somewhere safer, with the specific proviso that those files were to be maintained and transmitted to the asteroid command post as soon as a secure channel was established. The transport had been intercepted 17 days before Brandt found the pod. She'd been on the transport as a prisoner, not related to Holloway, not related to any of this, just a casualty of the transit camp system, being redistributed to a higher security facility, because she'd demonstrated the kind of survival, persistence, that made Keth administrators nervous. She'd been in the transport's lower processing bay when the Keth boarding party had come through, and she'd been loose. She was always, at this point in her career, working at whatever bound her, and she'd had 12 seconds in an unguarded access corridor before the boarding party reached her section. In those 12 seconds, she'd found the transport's data vault, not by design, by the same instinctive habit of cataloging that had kept her functional for 17 months. She'd recognized the file headers. She'd recognized Perez's encryption signature. She'd done the fastest transfer of the most critical synthesis data she could manage in 9 of her 12 seconds, and in the remaining 3, she'd gotten into the maintenance crawl space and found the pod bay and made the choice. The choice had felt like a bad decision at the time. She had left Okafor behind, following his instruction, but she'd also left behind any possibility of doing what she'd just done in a considered and rational way. Left behind the option of returning with the information intact to something resembling a command structure. Left behind the cleaner version of this, in which a trained specialist delivered Project Holloway to the people who knew what to do with it. Instead, she'd been alone in a pod for 17 days, with the synthesis pathway in her head and the growing conviction that she was going to have to be both the carrier and the person who figured out how to use it. She'd come to a conclusion on day 14. The conclusion was this: the Keth had, in eliminating the researchers and corrupting the transport files, achieved the thing they'd intended to achieve. They had made it impossible for Holloway's compound to be synthesized and deployed through the normal pathway of a functioning military research infrastructure. But they had not accounted for the possibility that the person carrying the pathway might arrive in Keth custody and have to use it there, not deploy it. She couldn't deploy it. She had the synthesis knowledge, but not the equipment, and the equipment required a specialized research bay that no longer existed. But she could use the existence of it. She could use the knowledge of it as the most convincing element in a lie, because the most convincing lies are the ones where the core of what you're saying is true. The commander would be scanning for deception, reading her biology and her behavior and her language for the markers of fabrication, and those markers would not fire on the parts of what she said that were factually accurate. The Keth trusted their scanning technology. That was, she'd come to understand, one of the systematic habits of their civilization that had never been fully tested. They trusted their tools to detect what their tools were designed to detect, and they had not built their tools to account for a person who was telling the truth about everything that could be scanned and lying about everything that couldn't be. She had built her entire plan around that gap. She was not proud of this in the way she might once have been proud of something clever. Cleverness felt small and cold in a compound yard with 9 Keth guards and Okafor reading on the far wall. What she felt, if she felt anything on the surface of the calculation, was a kind of stripped-down clarity. The emotional weather of a person who has run out of everything except the essential, and found that the essential is enough. The essential was, she was paying attention and the enemy was not because they were stupid, because they were efficient. And efficiency, she had learned, was still learning, would keep learning, she supposed, for as long as there was a war to learn it in, was not the same as thoroughness. Efficiency selected for what it already knew how to process. It pruned the search space to the expected. A prisoner with no apparent means of escape was already in the pruned space. A prisoner who had spent 11 days in a pod preparing for a specific conversation was not in any search space the Keth had yet designed. That was, in the end, the only weapon that had ever worked. Not firepower, not technical superiority. They had that, definitively, in the way that a world ship has it over a transit station. Not numbers. Not even Halloway, which was real and important and would matter eventually, but which wasn't what had gotten her and Okafor out of that compound. What had gotten them out was attention, memory, the willingness to sit in a cold yard for 40 minutes and watch 9 guards rotate through their patterns until she knew their patterns better than they knew themselves. The willingness to read a face, a Keth face, a face built on different biology and different architecture, and a system of expression she'd had to teach herself from nothing. And to read it not perfectly, but well enough. The willingness to tell a lie that was made of truth. To build a weapon out of what the enemy already knew, and just hadn't arranged correctly. That was what humanity had, she thought. Not a monopoly on it. She'd been careful, over 17 months, to avoid the mistake of thinking that what worked for her was categorically unavailable to the Keth. They were intelligent. They were adaptive. They had their own form of attention and their own form of patience. What they didn't have, at least not yet, not in the form she'd encountered it, was the particular kind of attention that comes from having nothing else left. When you'd stripped everything down to the essential turned out to be a person looking very hard at a problem and refusing to accept that the problem had only the solutions the enemy expected it to have. She'd been in rooms, back before the war, back when she was doing ordinary analytical work on Meridian Station, when a problem seemed closed, and someone had sat down with it anyway, and found the thing nobody else had seen. She'd never thought of it then as a survival skill. She thought of it now as the oldest survival skill there was. Okafor stirred. She heard his breathing change from the rhythm of sleep to the rhythm of waking. She knew the difference, could distinguish them at 3 meters, had spent 9 months learning his particular version of each. How long? He said. Maybe 8 more hours. Compat holding? So far. He was quiet for a moment, and she heard the careful shift of his position. The accommodations you make when something is broken, and you're managing. I keep thinking about the gate, he said. The fusing. You did good. I got lucky. I didn't know it would hold open. He paused. I thought it would fuse shut. I was trying to give you time. She looked at the forward view. The canister was a Keth compound. Their gate controls are designed not to interact with Keth materials at high temperature. It would fuse the mechanism in whatever position it was in. You triggered it while the gate was cycling open. A pause. How did you know that? I didn't, she said. I found it on the transit just now, in the technical registry, the gate specifications. Shh. She looked at the small display she'd been working through while he slept. I'm going through everything I can access on this vessel. There's a lot in here. She could feel him looking at her. You didn't know when you threw me the canister, he said. You didn't know it would work. No. So you just... I gave you something to throw, she said. You figured out the throw. Another pause. That's a very generous interpretation. It's an accurate one. He was quiet for a while. Outside, the gray space had deepened. They were further from the installation now, past the zone of active patrol, in the stretch of unmaintained space that existed between the Keth Command Moon and the outer belt where the transit corridors ran. She'd been watching the patrol indicators on the navigation display. So far, nothing. Brant, he said. Yeah. What do you think happens when this gets there? She thought about it. She thought about the asteroid command post, which she'd never seen. She'd only known it as a set of coordinates and a contact protocol, the skeleton of a military structure trying to remain functional after losing most of its body. She thought about the 4 ships that were supposedly still operational. She thought about what 73 years of research into a Keth vulnerability might mean to 4 ships and an asteroid. I think it changes the math, she said. Enough? She looked at the point of light on the forward view. Still small. Still distant. I don't know. Maybe not by itself. But, she paused, looking for the right phrasing. Something that was honest about the uncertainty, and also honest about the other thing. The thing about changing the math is that you don't always know what it changes until you've changed it. You find out downstream. That's not reassuring. No, she looked at the display. But it's true. He thought about that. She could hear him thinking. It was a thing she'd noticed about Okafor from the beginning, the audible texture of his consideration, something in the quality of his breathing that changed. When he was working through something, rather than just existing in the moment, she'd found it useful in the transit camps as an indicator. She'd come to find it, over 9 months, something more than useful. When we get there, he said, the asteroid. He stopped. Is there a plan? Not yet. Are you going to make one? On the way, she felt, across the dark between the co-pilot seat and the pilot position, the thing she'd felt from him in the compound yard, the sense of a person who is not convinced but who is choosing to be alongside anyway, the double blink. Whatever you're doing, I'm with you, she said. There's a section in the Halloway files that nobody's worked on yet. The synthesis pathway I know, the part I encoded on the chip, but there's a secondary application protocol that requires a specific delivery mechanism. And the delivery mechanism requires engineering, and the engineering requires someone with the technical background to understand what they're building and why. Who? There was a name in the files. A researcher who was flagged as the lead on the delivery mechanism before the installations were hit. Flagged as missing, not confirmed dead. She paused. The Keth destroyed the installations. They didn't destroy the people who weren't there when the installations were hit. Okafor was very still. You're saying? I'm saying that when we get to the asteroid, the first thing I'm going to do after I give them the chip is find out whether that researcher is still alive. She looked at the forward view. And if they are, I'm going to go find them. A long pause. And if I said I wanted to come, he said. She thought about his arm. She thought about his 6 hours under a reading, and the blue-gray membrane and the careful way he was managing the damage. She thought about what he'd done with the canister. Then you'd better sleep, she said, because we've got 8 hours, and you're going to need all of them. She heard him settle. She heard his breathing begin its slow cycle back toward sleep. She turned back to the controls and the forward view, and the small, distant point of light that was, by her calculation, approximately 31 hours away at this speed. She added another 4 hours for the approach protocol, another hour for whatever clearance procedure the asteroid command post was running now, another 2 for the kind of debrief that followed a capture and an extraction. Call it 37 hours. She'd survived 17 days in a pod. 37 hours was nothing. She thought about the commander. She thought about it standing in the compound yard, in the specific stillness of a decision being made, and she thought about what it had seen when it looked at her. A prisoner with nothing, negotiating from desperation, asking for terms it had no real leverage to demand. And she thought about the gap between what it had seen and what was actually there. She didn't hate the commander. She'd examined this in herself, carefully, over the course of the hour in the compound yard, in the way you examine something you might be wrong about. She'd expected to find hatred somewhere in the architecture, and she hadn't. What she'd found instead was something more like the opposite of contempt. Not respect exactly. Not anything so bilateral, but something like the acknowledgement that you are dealing with a serious opponent who is taking you seriously, and who you are going to defeat anyway, through means that have nothing to do with seriousness. Through means that have to do with a woman in a pod, working the problem, finding the gap. She was still working the problem. She was going to keep working the problem. The compound was behind her. The chip was in her pocket. The man she'd gone back for was asleep in the co-pilot position, and the vessel was moving forward through a dark that was, just for this moment, unpatrolled. She hummed something. She didn't do it on purpose. It came out of her without her deciding, a fragment of something she'd heard once in a corridor on Meridian Station. Someone's music playing through an open door, something that had stuck in the way small things stick when you're not paying attention to anything in particular. She hummed it once quietly and stopped. Then she looked back at the forward view and the point of light and flew toward it. She had a little over an hour. She used the first 40 minutes to sit with her knees drawn up in the cold shadow of the wall and think through every component of the plan with the unhurried care she'd learned to bring to things like this. Things where the difference between careful and careless was measured in lives. She went over the guard rotation again. She went over the canister, still clipped inside her boot. She went over the compound she'd told the commander it contained versus what it actually contained. Holloway's compound, in the real files, required intravenous delivery to be effective. Dermal application to any region of the Keth body would not produce the kill command interruption she, D, described. The compound in her boot was a dermal sealant, biologically inert to Keth physiology, and would scan as exactly the kind of sophisticated biochemical agent she'd claimed. It was, because it was in fact, a sophisticated biochemical agent, just not for the purpose she'd implied. What she'd actually planned to do was different from anything she'd told the commander. When the guards were in their gap, 11 seconds, 9 guards, a rotation that created a clean line of sight from the north wall position to the gate. She wasn't going to demonstrate anything. She was going to cross 11 meters of yard to the compound wall. There was a loading access panel on the interior face of the north wall, approximately 8 meters up, that she'd spotted in her first survey of the compound. It wasn't a door. It wasn't designed for human entry. It was a maintenance port for the climate control system that kept the Keth equipment at its correct temperature range. And it was automated, which meant it cycled on a timer, and she'd been watching that timer through the gaps in the guard rotation for 40 minutes now, and had it too, approximately 9-second precision. She could not climb the wall. The surface was too smooth, the material too dense. There was no purchase at all. What she could do, what she was going to do, required Okafor. She'd worked this out in the last 10 minutes of her calculation period, the part where she allowed herself to see the plan clearly for the first time, without the distorting fear that she'd be wrong. She couldn't climb the wall alone, but a human being 6 feet tall and strong could serve as a platform for another human being. If the first human being was kneeling in the right position and had their hands free to provide a stable base, Okafor was not kneeling. Okafor was wrapped in blue-gray membrane and bound at the wrists, and he'd been under reading for 6 hours. But she'd watched him working at the filament, and she'd watched the minute shifts in his posture over the last hour, and she thought, she believed, that he'd made enough progress on the binding that when the moment came, he could get his hands out. She thought. She believed. There was no way to verify this short of asking him, and asking him meant speaking, and speaking meant the guards would hear. She would not ask. She'd trust what she'd seen in his eyes and in the double blink, and in the 17 months of accumulated evidence that Jonas Okafor was the single, most reliably functional human being she'd ever operated in a combat environment with. She checked the position of the light, the angle of the gray sky above the compound walls. The hour she'd requested had almost run its course. She rechecked the mathematics one final time. 11 seconds of gap. 11 meters of yard across open ground to the north wall. 6-second loading port cycle. 3 meters of human body standing on the shoulders of another human body. The port was at 8 meters. 2 meters of reach from a proper platform would get her to 7 meters. Close enough to catch the port as it opened, if she was fast. Close enough if Okafor was standing. If his hands were free. If he could bear her weight for the 3 or 4 seconds she'd need. A lot of ifs. She'd survived on worse odds. She stood. She nodded to the nearest guard. "I'm ready," she said. They unbound her hands in the north section of the yard, as she'd asked, in the light, with 9 guards positioned at 3-meter intervals, in a semicircle, that left her approximately 4 meters of clear space in every direction. The commander stood at the center of the semicircle. Okafor had been moved to the east edge of the yard, away from her. She registered this with a flicker of alarm and adjusted her plan immediately, restructuring the timing in the 4 seconds she had before she needed to begin the demonstration. The canister was in her right hand. She'd retrieved it from her boot in the moment of having her hands freed, smoothly, while the filament was being removed, in the way you practice 100 times in your head, so that when the moment comes, the body just does it. The commander watched her. She began to speak. She narrated the demonstration as she performed it, describing the compound, its properties, the correct application methodology, using the real language from the real files, because the real language would scan as authentic to anything the commander was running, describing the inoculation she'd supposedly received with enough specific detail to hold up against a basic physiological scan. She applied the canister's contents to the dorsal region of her own neck, exactly as she'd described, slowly, and with the precise care of someone doing something dangerous and wanting to be seen doing it correctly. The scanning signatures would be exactly as she'd promised. The Keth scanners would see a sophisticated biochemical compound passing through human dermal tissue. They would see the absorption patterns. They would see what looked like a controlled demonstration of exactly what she'd claimed. She talked. She narrated. She watched the commander's ridge and neck with the full focused attention of someone reading for their life, which was what she was doing. She also, in the peripheral architecture of her awareness that had been running a parallel track since she'd stood up, watched the guard rotation. Cluster 1, northeast position. Cluster 2, northwest position. Cluster 3, direct north, between her and the wall. She needed Cluster 3 to rotate east. The rotation would begin. She checked the sky, the light, the shadows on the ground. In approximately 90 seconds, she slowed her narration, elaborated a detail she'd already covered, responded at length to a question the commander's translator had relayed to her. She was buying 90 seconds, which wasn't obvious, which looked like the natural pace of a careful technical demonstration. Cluster 3 began to rotate. She looked at Okafor, across the 20 meters between them. He'd been watching her the whole time. She couldn't see his hands. They were behind his back, bound or unbound. She couldn't tell from this distance. She did the only thing she could do. She threw him the canister. It was a terrible throw. Her arms hadn't been free for long enough. Her shoulder was wrong. The canister was the wrong shape for distance. But she didn't need accuracy. She needed distraction. The canister arsed across 20 meters of yard and landed 3 meters short of Okafor and skittered on the hard gray ground. And every guard in the compound looked at it. And in that fraction of a second, the commander tilted its head to follow the trajectory. And Brant ran. 11 meters. She'd counted the steps in her head 100 times. Her boots hit the compound floor, and she counted. 1, 2, 3. The guards were already turning. 5, 6, 7. She heard the Keth command word go out. The short, hard bark that meant something like, halt. 8, 9. She hit the north wall at full sprint and pushed off the ground with everything she had left. She got her hands to the loading port at precisely the moment it cycled open. The port was 40 centimeters wide and 20 centimeters tall. It was not designed for a human body. It was designed for a maintenance tool. She got her left arm in up to the shoulder. She got her right hand through. She felt something in her shoulder give. Not break, just stretch past the edge of what it was meant to do. She pulled. She heard the commander's voice behind her, in Keth, and she heard the different quality of it. The register shift that meant, this is a command of consequence. She heard the guard's feet on the ground. Different from human footsteps. The Keth had 4 points of ground contact and moved with a rhythm like a fast tripod. And she could hear 6 of them coming. She was halfway through the port when it started to cycle closed. She had a bad moment. There is a particular quality to the moment when a plan that has cost 17 months of careful survival to construct arrives at the point of maximum uncertainty, not the fear of death, exactly, which she'd made her peace with in approximately the 11th hour of the first day of the pod, but something closer to the fear of waste, of all of it being for nothing, of the plan being not quite good enough. She breathed. She pulled. She used her shoulder the way you use a lever, not a joint, putting the geometry of her body to work in the 3.5 seconds before the port finished its cycle. She came through on the other side. The maintenance corridor was dark, narrow, and smelled of ozone and something organic she had no name for. She didn't stop moving. She didn't look back. She went forward along the corridor in the direction of the airflow, because the port cycled for climate control, because the airflow was the direction of the external environment, because the external environment was somewhere other than here. Behind her, through the wall, she could hear the compound. She could hear the commander's voice. She could hear the specific harmonic the Keth used for the kill command. She'd heard it once before, in the transit camp on Meridian, when a guard had decided a prisoner was attempting escape. It was a sound like a very low bell struck at the edge of its range, and after you heard it, once you never forgot it, and hearing it meant that in approximately 4 seconds, something she couldn't help was going to happen to one or more people in that compound. She ran. The corridor branched twice, and she took the branch that felt most external. A judgment call, a survivor's instinct. 17 months of reading environments she didn't know, and being right more often than wrong. She came out on the far side of the compound wall through a grated vent that gave to pressure and spilled her out taut onto the gray-black ground of the moon surface, 15 meters from the wall in the open. The sky was wrong-colored here. A blue-gray that wasn't blue enough to be welcoming, shot through with the running lights of a Keth world ship in high orbit. The gravity was low and wrong. The air tasted of something chemical and distant. She ran. She was 300 meters from the compound when she heard the explosion. Not loud, not dramatic. The Keth were too precise for dramatic. It was a controlled demolition. She recognized the signature, the way the sound came, in 2 discrete waves rather than 1. And it came from the direction of the compound's gate. And her first thought was, the commander ordered the transport destroyed. Her second thought, following it almost simultaneously, was that the commander would not destroy a transport with Keth personnel on board. Her third thought, Okafor. She stopped. She stood on the gray surface of the Keth command moon, 300 meters from a compound full of Keth guards, alone, her left arm not working properly. Her shoulder, something she was going to deal with later, and she stood there for 11 seconds, making the decision. Then she went back. She came in low and fast from the north, using the wall's shadow, using the same maintenance vent she'd exited. She went back through the corridor. She came out in the compound through the loading port. Still cycling, still unguarded, because the guards were at the gate, and she had approximately 3 seconds in the open yard before someone looked her way. Okafor was at the east wall still. His hands were free. He was standing. His bindings were in a pile at his feet. He was holding his left arm at a very careful angle that told her something was damaged there too, which meant they were going to be a matched pair, and she would laugh about that later, if there was a later. She crossed the yard. She got to him. She put her working arm under his working arm, and they moved toward the north wall and the maintenance port together, moving with the careful, calibrated speed of two people who are hurt and know exactly how hurt they can afford to be. The explosion, he said. I heard. Gates open, he said. She looked. He was right. The gate was standing open, and the 3 guard clusters were clustered around the gate facing outward, responding to something outside, not toward them. She adjusted her direction immediately, steering them toward the open gate rather than the port. What happened? She said. I threw the canister at the gate control, he said. Wrong compound, but it was enough to fuse the lock in the open position. I thought. He paused, saving breath. I thought you might want a bigger exit. She looked at him. He was gray with pain, and his left arm was held at the same terrible, careful angle as hers, and he'd been under a reading 6 hours, and he'd spent those same 6 hours working his filament, binding loose, and watching her across a compound and paying attention, and he'd still had enough left to throw a canister at a gate lock. Jonas, she said. Yeah, good call, he said again. They went through the gate. The guards didn't turn in time. 3 of them did, but the commander had given the kill command, and the kill command had gone to the wrong people. She understood that from the sound, from the fact that the guards she was passing were moving with the slightly off quality of autonomous units, without real-time command input. They were operating on last standing orders. The last standing orders presumably had been to respond to the gate incident, not to watch the yard. She would find out later. In fragments, from the intelligence reports that made it back to the asteroid command post, in the imperfect and delayed way that information moved through what remained of humanity's military communication network. What had happened in the compound after she left. She would find out that the commander had given the kill command to 3 of its own guards in an attempt to mobilize an effective response, and had misjudged the situation's geometry, and that in the aftermath the remaining guards had been unable to receive commands and had reverted to base protocols. She would find out much later that the Keth investigation into the incident had produced 2 separate reports, each attributing the failure to a different cause. One report concluded that Brandt had somehow administered a neural disruption compound to the commander in the demonstration. The other concluded that the failure was an internal command error, exacerbated by inadequate threat assessment protocols. Neither report was correct. Neither report would ever arrive at the correct conclusion, which was that no compound had been needed and no technology had been required. And what had actually happened in the compound was not a chemical attack or a technical failure. What had happened was a person who'd had 11 days in a life pod to think about a problem, and who had read 9 guards in a compound and found the gap in the pattern, and who had built a lie around a truth the way you build a wall, with weight at the base and care at the joints, and who had calibrated every element of that lie against what she knew about the enemy's psychology, and whose partner had been paying attention across 20 meters of cold gray yard. That was it. That was the whole of it. They made it to the transit hangar 2 kilometers north of the compound on foot, moving low, using the terrain. She'd clocked the hangar on the approach to the compound. She clocked everything on approach. It was the kind of habit that gets drilled into you or kills you. And she'd filed it away in the part of her memory that stored information she might need later. The hangar had 4 Keth short transit vessels and 2 human-spec prisoner transports that had been captured at some point and stripped for parts, and one of the Keth vessels had a propulsion profile she recognized. from a vessel she'd once been aboard as a prisoner, which meant she knew the control interface well enough to fly it badly. Badly enough would do. She got Okafor to the vessel. She got the hatch open. She got him strapped into the co-pilot position, which she was using as a medical bay, because she had no medical bay, and she checked his arm. It was broken, clean, stabilizable. And she got into the pilot position, and she spent 4 minutes doing things to the control interface that she wasn't entirely sure were the right things, and on the 5th minute, the vessel lifted. She didn't look back at the compound. She would think about looking back later, and decide that she hadn't been afraid to look, that it hadn't been a superstition or a sentimentality. She would decide that the reason she hadn't looked back was simpler than any of that. She'd already cataloged everything the compound had to tell her, and there was nothing left in the direction of backward, worth the time it would cost. Okafor was quiet for the first 40 minutes of the transit. She'd given him what was in the emergency kit. She'd found the kit under the co-pilot console, which was encouraging. It suggested the Keth hadn't fully stripped the vessel's emergency systems, and the pain had stepped back to a manageable register. She could tell by the way his breathing changed. "Brant," he said, when she'd set the transit course and leaned back and closed her eyes for a moment. "Yeah, what was actually in the canister?" She opened her eyes, looked at the readout. Dermal sealant, standard Keth surgical prep compound, completely inert. A pause. So the whole demonstration. "You were just talking," she said, slowly, counting guard rotations, buying time. Another pause. She heard him shift in the co-pilot seat, carefully, protecting the arm. "And the thing you told the cold commander about Holloway. Real," she said. "Holloway is real. The compound is real. The effect is real." She looked at the readout. "I just didn't use any of it. Because I didn't need to." She paused. "It's good to know, though, for later." He was quiet for a long time. The transit vessel moved through the gray space above the Keth command moon, and the planet turned below them, vast and indifferent, and the running lights of the world ship in orbit tracked across the forward view like a slow star. "Brant," he said again. "The finger." She waited. He stopped. When they were reading me. There was this one moment, about 4 hours in, when the one they called Yakaga, the one with the personal interest in me, I could tell the way he watched. "I saw him," she said. "He watched you the whole time. There was a moment where they'd run out of stimulus, and he was standing there looking at me, trying to figure out what to do next, and I realized." Okafor paused. "I realized he was doing it because he was afraid. Not of me. Of the commander. Of looking insufficient. Of not being enough." Brant said nothing. And I looked at him and I thought, "You're afraid of failing, and I'm afraid of dying. And somehow we wound up here." The vessel hummed. The gray space outside the forward view was empty in the specific way. That space around a military installation is always empty. Not clear, but cleared, actively maintained as such. "Does that help?" she said. "Knowing that?" "I don't know," Okafor said. Maybe not for me." He paused. "But maybe for whoever comes after us." She thought about that. She thought about the long trail, not hers, not exactly, but the one she'd been on since Meridian, which was older than Meridian, which was older than the war, the trail that had started the first time a Keth world ship entered human space, and a human on a monitoring station had said, "That's new. Mark it, catalog it, file it. Let's find out what it is." The trail of 17 months and 100 dead colleagues, and the transit camps, and the pod and the compound, and the 9 guards whose rotation she'd read, and the commander whose ridge musculature she'd studied, and the canister of nothing she'd held in her hand like a weapon that killed. The trail of attention, the trail of noticing. "Project Holloway," she said. Okafor looked at her. "It's real," she said. "I told the commander the truth about that. The compound is real. The effect is real. 73 years of accumulated data from 32 research installations. The Keth killed the scientists. They killed the analysts. They killed the command staff." She paused. "They thought they were closing the file. But But they don't know what the data actually shows. They destroyed the researchers. They didn't destroy the research. They corrupted the files. But corruption isn't deletion, and there are people on the asteroid who know how to reconstruct corrupted data if they have enough of the original context. She reached under the co-pilot console and pulled out the emergency kit, rooted through it, found what she was looking for. A Keth data chip, blank, standard format. I've had the synthesis pathway in my head for 11 days. I wrote it down while you were sleeping. She held up the chip. Okafor looked at it for a long moment. When did you? When I set the transit course. 4 minutes. She set the chip down on the console between them. The thing is, it doesn't matter that the commander thought I was running a con. It doesn't matter what the Keth reports say about what happened. By the time they figure out that nothing I did in that compound was what they thought it was, this will have already reached the asteroid. And then what? He said. She looked at the forward view. The gray space. The cleared emptiness. The far tiny point of light that she was navigating toward, which was too small to see clearly, and too far to reach in any reasonable time, but which was there. Then we'll see, she said. She said it quietly, without drama, the way you say something you mean. She watched the navigation display cycle through its automated checks. Proximity alerts, trajectory adjustments, the passive scan that pulsed every 40 minutes, and came back empty. Nothing in their path, nothing on their 6. She'd been watching it with the habitual attention of someone who understood that empty readings were not the same as clear readings, but who also knew when to let the mathematics run without interference. The display was doing its job. She let it. She thought about Meridian Station. She thought about it in the specific way she'd begun to allow herself to think about it. Not as a loss, not as the thing that had started all of this, but as a place that had existed, that had had its own texture and sound, and the specific bureaucratic smell of recycled air that all transit stations shared, and that had been full of people who'd been doing their jobs and building their lives and paying their particular kinds of attention to their particular corners of the world. She'd known 43 of those people well enough to miss them. She knew this because she'd counted once in the pod, when she'd needed something to do with the part of her mind that wasn't working the problem. 43. Some of them had been colleagues. Some had been what you called friends, when you lived on a transit station, which was a different category from groundside friendship, more expedient and more honest, built on proximity and shared context rather than chosen affinity. A few had been something else. The kind of people you found in transit places, where everyone was already in motion, and permanence was a word that meant something different than it did on a planet. She didn't think about them often. The 43 had been filed, carefully and respectfully, in a part of her memory that she accessed only when she could afford to, which was not often. She accessed it now, briefly, in the small space between the navigation display's 40-minute pulse and the next task she needed to do. 43 faces, 43 names. She went through them the way she went through anything that needed to be held. Not quickly, not ceremonially, just completely, accounting for each one. Then she closed the file. She had other work. The other work was the secondary protocol in the Halloway files. She'd been turning it over since day 8 in the pod. The part she hadn't told the commander about. The part she hadn't told anyone about, because it was the part that required the most, from the most specific set of circumstances, and she hadn't been sure the circumstances were achievable until she'd run the calculation for the 3rd time, and the calculation had come back the same. The secondary protocol was not a weapon. She wanted to be precise about this, at least in her own mind. The compound in the primary protocol interrupted the kill command. That was the weapon. The secondary protocol was something more like. She looked for the right word and settled on leverage. A tool that, applied correctly, didn't kill or disable, but shifted the terms of an engagement entirely. The way changing one variable in a complex system could cascade through every downstream calculation without touching a single element directly. The secondary protocol required the delivery mechanism. The delivery mechanism required the researcher. The researcher required finding. She had the name. She's at that last known location, flagged as missing, not confirmed dead. The kind of ambiguous notation that the Keth's systematic approach to eliminating research personnel sometimes left behind, because systematic approaches had their own gaps, their own repeating patterns, their own version of the 4-minute rotation. She was going to find the researcher. She was going to go into whatever space they were in. Keth controlled or not, transit camp or not, whatever it was. And she was going to find them the way she found everything, by paying very close attention and refusing to accept that the problem had only the solutions the enemy expected it to have. She would not do it alone. She thought about this and found that it felt different than it had 3 weeks ago. Before the pod, before the compound, she'd been alone for so long that the alternative had begun to feel theoretical. A thing that was possible in general, but not available in particular. Okafor sleeping in the co-pilot seat was a small data point in the revision of that model. A data point that had, in the last several hours, accumulated a weight she hadn't anticipated. She was not good at dependence. That was honest. She'd been shaped by the same forces that shaped most people who'd been on Meridian when the strikes happened. The self-reliance of the survivor, the trained habit of calculating without variables you couldn't control, the specific armor of someone who'd had everything stripped to the essential and found the essential was you alone, working the problem. But dependence was not the right word for what she was revising. The right word was something closer to trust that the other person is also working the problem. Trust that they are paying attention from their direction, and you are paying attention from yours, and the combined field of attention covers something neither of you could cover alone. That was not dependence. That was mathematics. She set a new marker on the navigation display, a secondary trajectory point, far to the outer belt, coordinates that corresponded to the last known location from the researcher's file. She didn't plot a course to it. She just placed the marker, something to navigate toward eventually, after the asteroid, after the debrief, after whatever came next in the sequence of next things. That was the operational reality of fighting a war with 4 ships and a command post that appeared on no Keth chart. The marker glowed a faint amber on the display, small, tentative, the way all forward-pointing things felt before they became the current problem. She looked at it for a moment, then she looked back at the forward view and the point of light that was the asteroid, and she flew. Outside, the Keth world ship's lights traced their slow arc. The moon fell behind them. The vessel moved forward through space. That was, for this moment, uncontested. Okafor leaned his head back. He closed his eyes. She could see him breathing, steady, deliberate, the breathing of someone who is choosing, minute by minute, to keep doing it. She turned back to the controls. She thought of Yakaga. She thought of him standing at the edge of the compound, watching Okafor, with the focused attention of personal hatred. And she thought of what Okafor had said. He was afraid. Afraid of the commander. Afraid of insufficient performance. Afraid in the way of a person whose entire system of power is built on the kill, command, on the ability to end things from a distance without ever having to survive them. She thought of the commander, the ridge vibration, the precise 3-phase calculation she'd watched play out. The moment of decision, visible and legible in the musculature of the neck that had produced the words. We agree to these terms. They'd agreed because the terms were reasonable. Because a prisoner in a sealed compound with 9 guards and a biometric gate had no obvious means of escape. And so a reasonable demonstration was just a reasonable demonstration. Because they had looked at her and seen what they expected to see, a prisoner who had run out of options and was negotiating from nothing. They'd been wrong about the options. She watched the world ship's running lights for approximately 3 minutes before she recognized what she was doing and filed it. She was reading it. Old habit, survival habit. When something was large enough to matter, you read it. The world ship was in high orbit above the command moon, far enough away that its details were reduced to pattern. The rhythm of its running lights, the configuration of its drive emissions as they registered on the vessel's passive sensors, the particular arrangement that told you something about its current operational state without requiring you to get close enough to be read in return. It was a standard Elder Caste command configuration. She'd seen 5 of them at varying distances over 17 months. This one was running what she'd categorized as maintenance cycle. The drive emissions in the pattern that indicated non-propulsive power draw. The lights in a rotation that corresponded to internal systems testing rather than navigation or combat readiness. Not active. Not aware of them, specifically, which was what mattered. She watched it for 1 more minute, committing the specific configuration to the part of her memory that stored useful data about Keth operational patterns, then turned her attention back to the navigation display and the amber marker she'd placed. The researcher's name was Dr. Amaka Solis. She'd read it in the Holloway files, briefly, in the way you read names in a classified document, registering but not dwelling. He'd been a xenobiochemist, lead on the delivery mechanism protocol, stationed at the 6th research installation. The 6th installation had been the last one hit. The notation in the file had been entered 4 days after the strike. Status unknown, location unknown, not confirmed deceased. She had held that notation in her memory for 11 days, testing it the way you test something that might be important and might be wishful thinking. Status unknown was not the same as dead. Location unknown was not the same as lost. In the specific language of military records under combat conditions, status unknown was what you wrote when you hadn't confirmed the outcome, and you didn't have the resources to investigate. It was the notation of an open file. She had a strong preference for open files. Her entire operational history for the last 17 months could be described as a series of decisions to treat things as open files that the available evidence suggested were closed. She thought about what she'd need when she found him, if she found him, to make the secondary protocol viable. She ran through the equipment list she'd assembled from the files. Most of it was either fabricatable or available through Keth supply chains that she'd spent the last year learning to read from the outside. None of it was impossible. Some of it was difficult. Difficult was not the same as unavailable, and unavailable was not the same as impossible, and she'd stopped treating difficult as a meaningful category somewhere around month 3. The navigation display pulsed. She checked it. Still empty, she thought. What they would do with it when they had it was not her calculation to make. That was the asteroid command post's calculation. The people with the larger view, the people who could see the war at the scale at which it needed to be seen, to make strategic decisions. She had no illusions about her place in that architecture. She was an analyst who'd become an operative by attrition, who'd survived by the kind of escalating improvisation that was not a career trajectory so much as a description of the only trajectory available. What she was good at was the compound, the 9 guards, the 4-minute rotation, the gap. The asteroid command post was good at the other things. This division of labor seemed sound to her. She looked at Okafor's profile in the co-pilot seat. The careful stillness of his sleep, the controlled economy of his breathing. The broken arm held at exactly the angle that minimized pain. She thought about the 6 hours of the reading and the filament he'd worked loose, and the canister he'd thrown at the gate control. She thought about the look he'd given her across 20 meters of compound yard when she'd thrown the canister to him. Not confusion, not hesitation, just attention. Just, I see what you need. Let me see what I have. Let me find the version of this that works. She thought that was probably the most useful quality a person could have. She filed it. She filed it next to the 43 names, and the secondary trajectory point and the long list of Keth operational patterns, and the specific 3-phase ridge vibration that meant high-level assessment, and she flew. She didn't feel triumphant about this. Triumph was for people who'd stopped paying attention, and she could not afford to stop paying attention. There would be another compound. There would be another commander. There would be another set of 9 guards whose rotation she'd have to read. Another lie she'd have to calibrate. Another canister of nothing she'd have to hold in her hand like a weapon. But the weapon had worked. And the weapon was not the canister, and not the compound, and not the 73 years of data on a chip that she was carrying to an asteroid command post in a stolen Keth vessel. The weapon was the same thing it had always been. The same thing it had been on the first monitoring station, when the first Keth world ship entered human space and someone had said, "Mark it, catalog it, let's find out what it is." The weapon was a person in a bad situation, paying very close attention. She flew through the gray space toward the point of light that was too small to see clearly, and too far to reach in any reasonable time. She flew toward it anyway. Behind her, Okafor slept. The vessel's running lights traced their passage through the dark. Small, human moving forward.